One of the overarching foreign policy themes of Donald Trump's second administration has been his focus on the Western Hemisphere, or the Americas. The most obvious example of this is the deployment of a massive naval presence in the Caribbean, which amounts to the heaviest concentration of US naval power in the region since the Cold War, as part of a pressure campaign against the Venezuelan government. As such, observers have labelled Trump's Western Hemisphere pivot as the Donroe Doctrine, a play on words of the early 19th century Monroe Doctrine of President James Monroe. So in this video, we're going to explain this apparent Donroe Doctrine, why Trump is seemingly so obsessed with the Western Hemisphere, and whether it's actually fair to call it a doctrine at all. The TLDR Black Friday sale is now on. That includes our biggest ever discounts on all products, including our coffee table book, our 2025 calendars, our colouring book, posters starting at $17.99, and much more. Find the full collection at toolong.news or by clicking the link in the description. Offer ends December 3rd. So we're going to start by rattling through a historical crash course on US foreign policy in the Americas. In 1823, President James Monroe established what came to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. Essentially, he said that the US would not accept any attempts by European powers to colonize or intervene in the affairs of the nations of the Western Hemisphere, effectively separating the Americas and Europe into distinct spheres. The Monroe Doctrine has of course evolved over the following 200 years, and is often seen as synonymous with unilateral US intervention in the region it considers its backyard. A major evolution of the doctrine came in 1904 with the more assertive Roosevelt Corollary, in which President Teddy Roosevelt said that the US had the right and responsibility to act as an international police power in the Western Hemisphere in flagrant cases of wrongdoing or impotence. Over the coming years, this justified US interventions in the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Haiti. But in the 1930s, this assertive doctrine took a back seat, as a policy of non-interventionism came to the fore, with President Franklin Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy. The Monroe Doctrine then re-emerged in Washington's foreign policy calculations in the second half of the 20th century, as the spectre of communism haunted the Americas during the Cold War. Even if it wasn't always officially invoked, it prompted a multitude of interventions across the region, including the invasions of Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Grenada, support for the Contras in Nicaragua, and the backing of coups in Guatemala and Chile. The Monroe Doctrine then lost relevance in the post-Cold War decades, particularly as the global war on terror, and later the pivot to Asia, reflected Washington's shifting priorities. In 2013, Secretary of State John Kerry declared that the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over, stating that interventionism was out and cooperation with equal partners in the region was in. However, Kerry's pronouncement turned out to be premature, because during Trump's first term, his then National Security Advisor John Bolton said in 2019 that today we proudly proclaim for all to hear the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well. In his second term, Trump's actions and rhetoric have signaled that this remains true, as he has focused significant attention on the Western Hemisphere and comparatively less on other parts of the world. Yes, he's put much political capital into ending the wars in Gaza and Ukraine, but these efforts could be seen as an attempt to wrap up those conflicts as quickly as possible in order to free up some resources for use closer to home. Trump has signaled that he views China as more of a trade rival than a military one, and his relaxed view on Taiwan suggests that he doesn't view the potential conflict over the island as much of an American concern. Meanwhile, Trump began his new term threatening territorial expansion, including Canada, Greenland, and Panama. He's also helped and rewarded his ideological allies. El Salvador's Nayib Bukele has received a tourism and economy-boosting stamp of approval from Trump, as well as a $5 million deal to incarcerate deportees, and secured the extradition of top gang members that Bukele was seeking. While Argentina was offered a $20 billion financial lifeline shortly before President Javier Milei faced crucial midterm elections. However, Trump's ideological opponents have faced very different treatments. He slapped 50% tariffs on imports from Brazil, led by left-wing President Lula da Silva, as the country prosecuted ex-President Bolsonaro. And Trump has halted aid to Colombia amid clashes with its leftist president, Gustavo Petro, on whom Trump has placed sanctions, accusing him of enabling drug trafficking. The US's biggest trade partners, Mexico and Canada, have also had to navigate Trump's tariff-heavy approach and bellicose rhetoric. However, it's Trump's approach to Venezuela that seems most representative of this renewed Monroe Doctrine. The Trump administration has offered a $50 million reward for the capture of Venezuela's revolutionary socialist president, Nicolas Maduro, while declaring him the head of a foreign terrorist organization, a move which could precede a regime change-oriented military attack on the country. Not far from Venezuela, the US military has deployed a massive naval presence in the Caribbean at the expense of other regions, and has been striking alleged drug trafficking boats near Venezuela, sparking serious questions about legality and further raising regional tensions. The Trump administration's primary justifications for this array of actions have been reducing immigration and drug flows, particularly when it comes to military threats against Venezuela, tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and Trump's militarization of the southern border, while things like supposed trade unfairness and countering Chinese influence has driven other actions, like pressuring Panama to quit China's Belt and Road Initiative. But is it fair to say that all of this amounts to a coherent Donroe Doctrine? Trump has often spoken out about what he's described as an enemy from within, as well as the invasion at the US-Mexico border. So this Western Hemisphere focus does align with his apparent perception of what the country's most pressing threats are. And his actions and rhetoric certainly resemble an approach that sees the Western Hemisphere as the US's backyard, where he can and will attempt to shape the region's political future with coercive diplomacy, and by rewarding allies and punishing foes. Personal grievances appear to be an important feature too. Even after Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney built a workable relationship with his US counterpart, Trump last month threatened additional tariffs on Canadian imports after a Canadian political advert aired by Ontario Province quoted Ronald Reagan's criticism of tariffs. However, some analysts argue that, fun wordplay aside, treating this as a coherent doctrine is too generous. Sure, you can work backwards from Trump's actions and retrofit a somewhat consistent doctrine around them, but it's not like he stood up and articulated a specific America's strategy. Daniel Drezner, for example, argues that Trump's actions in the Western Hemisphere have been, quote, just a bunch of stuff that happened, rather than being driven by an underlying strategy, with each action bearing the fingerprints of different officials. Marco Rubio in Venezuela, Peter Navarro in Canada, and Scott Bessent in Argentina, for example. Ultimately though, whether or not you think Trump's actions constitute a coherent Donroe Doctrine, Trump's administration is paying more attention to its home region than any US administration has for at least 30 years, a reality that Trump's friends and foes alike are having to adapt to. If you're interested in major news events like this, you'll have certainly been paying attention to what's been happening in the Middle East recently, with the whole region seemingly in a state of flux. That's why the next issue of our magazine, Too Long, is all about that issue, with our headline section titled The New Middle East. Plus, this Black Friday, we're running our cheapest price ever, with new subscribers getting their first copy as cheap as $2.99. As I said, this next issue is all about the Middle East, running through each country in the region and discuss their future, before reflecting on how recent events have reshaped the Middle East forever. We obviously talk about the Middle East a lot in videos, but this is our most zoomed out, detailed and thought through coverage yet, truly outlining how we see this region re-emerging. It's not just that though, there have also been a lot of major elections this year. So in this issue, we have a whole section talking about all of the major elections that have taken place this year, and how global politics has changed. China's continued dominance, politics in the UK, and how politicians have hijacked social media. This latest issue is now available for pre-order on our website, and if you subscribe using the code Black Friday at checkout, then you'll get £5 off your first copy, bringing the price down to as low as $2.99. Plus, there's also special subscriber bundles, including our other TLDR products, which offer even greater value. Anyway, click the link in the description for all of the offers, and thank you for supporting the channel.